started. Hello everyone, welcome to the second talking series on politics, sex and gender, organised by CAPE, the Centre for Applied Philosophy, Politics and Ethics, and the Centre for Transforming Sexuality and Gender, as well as the University of Ghent. Both those centres are here at Brighton. I can't remember what it's called in Ghent. The Centre for
Ethical Inquiry.
Ethical Inquiry. Today we've got Heather Brunskell-Evans, who's going to talk to us about pornography and the performance of sexual freedom. Heather is a visiting senior research fellow at the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries at King's College London. She's just recently moved there from Leicester. Her research focuses on the gendering of the body by contemporary discourses of sexuality and medicine. And in particular, she analyses the biopolitics of pornography, prostitution, the sex trade and transgenderism as material practices that occur within the context of structural gender inequality, neoliberalism, global capitalism, and the proliferation of digital technologies. She's published widely on these subjects and on sexual and gender politics in general, including most recently Performing Sexual Liberation, the Sexualized Body and the Medical Authority of Porn, and then forthcoming is this, Internet Pornography, Disciplining Women Through Sexual Freedom. So, over to you, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not using PowerPoint, and I'm probably going to be walking a little bit back and forth. This is my style, so I hope that's okay with you. Can you hear me at the back?
No, not really.
Not really, okay. So I'm going to have to try to shout and read at the same time. Okay? Tell me if I'm not doing that successfully after a few minutes. Okay. So, what I'm going to argue today is that doing philosophy uncovers knowledge, firstly, that pornography is not about sexual liberation, but about exploitation, and secondly, that pornography is immoral. So, wherein does the exploitation and immorality lie? I argue that pornography is immoral because it's inherently dehumanizing, and this dehumanization takes specific structural forms. It is specifically gendered, and within that, it is classed and racialized. And I use two philosophers to help me develop this line of thought, and they are the work of the social historian Michel Foucault and the radical feminist philosopher Andrea Dworkin. Firstly, I use the method of genealogy supplied by Foucault to bring critical thought to bear upon power and its relation to sexuality. And secondly, I use Dworkin to explore the question, are women human? So I need to make a point here before I proceed. Just in case, as listeners, some of you hear me saying something that I'm not. In hoping to demonstrate that pornography is exploitative and immoral, I'm not arguing that it should be banned or censored. Okay, I'd like you to frame the rest of this lecture within that context. First, before I talk about Foucault and Dworkin, I want to talk about the moral justification that we presently have for pornography. And I want to start that by talking about the narrative of the pornography industry of the 1970s. This probably seems like a very, very long time ago, but I can assure you that the that the pornography industry of the 1970s, the history of that, of the changes that the pornography industry brought about, are with us still and are constitutive of how we understand pornography now. So, the narrative of the pornography industry of the 1970s was that pornography has the potential to liberate individuals from traditional mores and values. Out went the idea that men who watched pornography are sad losers who couldn't find flesh and blood women to have sex with them. And in came the idea that pornography and its consumption are cool and hip. Its male consumers can be both educated and intelligent and be in relationship with women. Its female performers can challenge traditional repressive constraints placed upon feminine sexuality. So, the strongest narrative of the pornography industry at that time, at that cultural change that really happened in the 1970s, was that pornography fills a progressive role. It helps us escape the disciplinary, censorious, outmoded, patriarchal mores and religious values of the past. And here the Victorian period was invoked as a significant historical moment that entrenched sexual repression and from whose shackles we as a society need to be released if we are to be sexually free. The pornography industry, the industry repackaged pornography as a tool to help us reach this sexual paradise. The capitalist agenda of the pornography industry was, of course, unconcerned about women's equality. At that moment in time, there was the political struggle of feminism in the 1970s, and the pornography industry sort of slotted itself into the discourses which were occurring at that time about women's equality. But like all industries, its predominant aim is to carve out a market and to incite longing and desire for its products. And the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s and the consequent movements of feminism opened up that market for it. And then all of us in this room are the inheritors of that male left-wing rebranding of pornography that ensued. So, in considering contemporary pornography and ethics, the terms commonly used to justify pornography are the following. Pornography is fantasy, not reality. It's a legitimate space in which various sexual identities, which have hitherto been repressed, can find expression. For example, the sexualities of women, gay and lesbian people, transgender people and transsexuals, disabled people, and so on. So, pornographic sex in this narrative is sex in the raw, a domain stripped of the taboos and heterosexual norms which traditionally have regulated sexuality. Of course, consumers of pornography are fully aware that the sex is staged and that performers are acting. However, since the performers are both acting and having actual, not simulated sex, and since the consumer in masturbating to the sex acts, or indeed interacting with performers in the virtual space of webcams, is undergoing a fully embodied experience that feels external to politics. Because of this, pornography itself is deemed to be outside of politics, since it facilitates, in this narrative, the free expression of the visceral and of the individual's personal fantasies and desires. Pro-pornography discourses construct pornography as value-free or agnostic. Indeed, the argument goes, issues of morality have no place with regard to pornography. The performers are consenting, Indeed, the women performers, I've been assured on many occasions by heterosexual guys, get sexual pleasure from their work, i.e. they get paid for what they like doing best. Pro-pornography proponents are not averse, however, to executing what I call a reverse moralizing. Any critique of pornography, I have discovered, elicits the following judgments. Critics are accused of being whorephobic. Apparently critics hate the women who work in pornography because they don't like seeing women being agentic, expressing their own sexuality in their own autonomous ways. Critics are accused of being sex negative, i.e. their moral censors who align themselves with outmoded tradition or religious fundamentalism. And critics wish to ban pornography and thus shut down free speech. Am I clear at the back as I'm speaking? Okay, that's good. So, I now turn to Foucault and Dworkin. So I problematise this sex radical liberal narrative and its reverse moralism by calling upon the work of Foucault and Dworkin. Foucault and Dworkin are two iconic figures of the late 20th century who commented critically on sexual politics. They take the sexual ethics of pro-pornography proponents and place them on a different terrain of analysis than that of the now populist form of argumentation, the one that I've just described. Each begins in their different ways from the question, what does it mean to be human today? So I'm going to start with Foucault. I'm going to presuppose a little bit of knowledge of Foucault, but if there isn't any, I hope this isn't too arcane. Foucault's contribution can be seen in the crucial shift or conceptual tearing, as in the tearing of fabric, that his method of genealogy renders to the ordering of our thought about sexuality. What is this rupture that genealogy brings? Does anybody know what genealogy refers to?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, I'm going to continue on as if as if people do know, but we can talk about it in questions afterwards if necessary. Okay. So, broadly speaking, genealogy is a historical method that traces the birth and historical construction of sexuality. In deploying this method, we could call it a method of deconstructing discourses, Foucault argues that the facticity of sex, its biology, its psychology, its drives, its fantasies, those things that we take as key or foundational for our identity in modernity, us as modern subjects, I mean, we take sexuality as key to almost to our very soul. Foucault argues that this is socially constructed, and by making this argument, not making the argument that in different historical periods we understand our sexuality differently, he's doing something much more radical than that. He's saying that the sex itself, not sexuality, but sex itself is socially constructed. So the historical argument is usually, and the argument from those who advocate that pornography is about sexual freedom and sexual liberation, those people too argue that sex is, that we experience our sexuality different in different historical periods. As I've just described, we always return to the Victorian period as that historical period which repressed sex. So now, thankfully, in this argument, which I don't agree with, We've arrived at the 21st century, and we're throwing off the shackles of that historical period to arrive at a true sexuality and its true sexual expression. So what Genealogy is doing in the hands of Foucault is arguing that the sex in itself is historical. There isn't such a thing as the sex that our individual biological, psychological sex. That notion is a particular way of understanding ourselves which didn't exist before the 19th century. And in taking that stance, in making that argument, Foucault can cut through many of the liberationist arguments. So, when did this construction of sex begin? Foucault argues it began in the 19th century when medicine, psychology, and psychoanalysis constructed it. Discourses about sex described it as the ground of our being and that upon which moral or scientific judgments could be made of any identity that didn't conform to the sexuality of the responsible heterosexual bourgeois couple. And in the construction of sexuality, a sub-race of perverts emerged, according to Foucault. And I'm going to list a few of them. He calls them precocious girls, homosexuals, hysterical women, maniacal husbands, paedophiles, nymphomaniacs, to name but a few. So, from this point of view, every time we evoke the notion of a born sexual identity, that is, even as is being said at this moment with regard to transgenderism, that this can be dislocated from the biological body, but there's an appeal to the idea that there's a true sexual identity. When we say that, according to Foucault, we do not escape Victorianism, we resurrect its tenets and reify its truths. Secondly, Foucault argues, the relationship of power to sexuality is not that of sovereign power, as in the rhetoric of pro-pornography proponents. So in this, from that position, the relationship of power to pornography is one that says no to it. Religion, patriarchy, radical feminists are all lumped together as censors, as those people who want to say no to a natural sexuality expressed through pornography. We will remember that Foucault says there is no such thing as a natural sexuality. It's actually constructed around the idea of the norm, the heterosexual norm, and all the deviant positions that are a byproduct of that. So Foucault agrees that the Christians, the patriarchs, the doctors and the lawyers all took part of the disciplinary technologies that brought sex and the diverse sexual identities into being. However, closer inspection reveals that the relationship of power to sex is more productive than negative. It produces subjectivities. It produces sexual identities. So, Foucault argues, we must abandon the hypothesis, remember this is the hypothesis that is crucial to the pro-pornography argument. We must abandon the repressive hypothesis. We must abandon the idea that modern industrial societies have ushered in an age of increased sexual repression. We must abandon the idea that no society has been more prudish than ours until, in fact, pornography came along to rescue us from this prudishness. Whilst doing the genealogy of sexuality, it is the opposite that has become apparent. Never has there existed, according to Foucault, more centres of power. Never have there existed more sites where the intensity of pleasures of the body and the persistence of power catch hold only to spread elsewhere and set up new sites which accumulate and accumulate, never-endingly so. He goes on to say, since the 19th century until our present moment, a concatenation of increasingly perverse sexual identities has been ensured and relayed by the countless economic interests which, with the help of medicine, psychiatry, prostitution and pornography, have tapped into this analytical multiplication of pleasure and this optimization of power. So, Foucault's thesis contrasts with the hypothesis of repression held by proponents of pornography as sexual freedom. The ethical solution, in the pro-pornography view, to the pathologization of diverse sexual identities is to remove the interdictions against them and to set their expression free. Indeed, in this view, pornography is a space in which, for example, men with sexual desires for precocious girls can express these harmlessly through legally adult women dressed up as girls. Men can fantasize about rape, and as I have been informed by defenders of pornography many times, this can help prevent rape in the real world. In Foucault's view, power as productive, that is not just repressive, does not escape from sexual discipline. So what happens in the pornography produces and reproduces different kinds of identities. But it doesn't allow us to escape from oppression. It actually disciplines us. And I'm going to go now on to Andrea Dworkin, and because she takes up the cudgel, as it were, at this point. She doesn't deploy the method of genealogy. She is a historian and a philosopher, as well as an exited prostitute. And she herself traces the patriarchal, medical, psychological, and religious construction of what she calls female nature. And it's the female nature which makes the construction of female nature that helps mobilize pornography as alleged sexual liberation. In pornography, she argues, femininity is the degraded other through which men's metaphysical assertion of the self is fashioned. The metaphysics of male sexual domination is that women are whores. So, whilst pornography proliferates an allegedly diverse set of female sexual identities that cater to any taste, the girl who wants to fuck daddy tonight, the slut who loves being gagged by a penis till she's almost choking and asphyxiated, the woman who is being anally penetrated whilst her mouth is gagged by a rope, the Asian woman who's compliant and loves being raped, the black woman who is so animalistic she induces men to have to take her by force. Whatever the alleged diverse tastes of the consumer, the representations of women in Dworkin's view are monologic. They posit the female nature as that which is essentially fulfilled by the act of violation, which in turn transforms the violation by men into only using women for what they're made for who they actually are. And thus the blame is not in the men if the women don't enjoy it, but to the woman for not being womanly or female enough to enjoy what is being done to her. She argues one doesn't violate something by using it for what it is. Pornography is not seen as an abuse of the female as a human being because the female is fulfilling her natural function as a whore. That is why pornography performance is held to be voluntary and emancipatory, even when the performer is name-called, hair-pulled, choked, gagged, beaten or raped. So, pornography doesn't release women from the patriarchal dichotomy of virgin whore or nice woman slut, which is pornography's, the discourse of, the narrative that pornography tells. but it constructs and reconstructs this ancient patriarchal discourse ad nauseum. So, in conclusion, Foucault and Dworkin invite us to examine the discourses of radical sexual politics for their reactionary, normative effects. I'm going to talk a little bit about internet pornography now, and I don't know how long I've had. Anybody?
About 20 minutes.
Oh, good.
25.
Good. So, using the conceptual terrain that Foucault and Dworkin have mapped out, we can see that the concepts used to justify pornography, either personally in our own use of it, or by the industry, are deeply embedded in and emerge from sexual exploitation. I break this exploitation down into three indivisible aspects. Firstly, the object produced by the industry is a human being rendered into a thing to be consumed. And in this, pornography is a branch of prostitution, the branch which is filmed. And I know that there has been a big separation in people's minds, an ideological separation in my view, between prostitution and pornography. I am arguing that pornography and prostitution are not divided in that way, that pornography is actually prostitution, a branch of prostitution. All the politics of prostitution are present. The payment for sex, the pimping, the trafficking, the coercion, the social and psychological conditions under which performers consent, their personal histories and life stories of the performers before entering pornography, and the gendered, classed and racialized issues of prostitution. Secondly, the consumer treats the objects he masturbates to, the human being, as a thing divested of her humanity, and in doing so, he divests himself of his own humanity. And thirdly, one doesn't have to be a producer, a performer, or a consumer to be caught up in the deleterious effects of pornography. As individuals, all of us, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on our levels of active engagement and depending on our age, are disciplined in our humanity by pornography. The pornographic imagination is imperialistic. It spreads everywhere, including our children's first introduction to sexuality, and including now the phenomenon that women watch pornography too. Something which is constantly being said to me. So, in women watching pornography and being aroused by pornography, what she's being aroused by is the brutalization of her sisters. So, how then might we reimagine freedom, sexual pleasure, and sexual ethics? In contrast to Foucault's thesis that sexuality is not repressed by the society in which we live, but is constantly being incited, and of which pornography is a major incitement, and in contrast to the radical feminist view, which understands pornography as the eroticization of male dominance and female submission, sex radicals insist, as I've said, that pornography is the release from sexual oppression. It is often argued that to say that the overwhelming content of pornography is violence towards women is excessive and outrageous, despite all the empirical evidence to demonstrate that that is what it is. It's argued that pornography is not one thing, since it has many genres and subgenres that subvert heteronormativity. Pornography, it is argued, is a rich resource for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people whose non-normative sexualities are marginalized and disciplined. I argue that whilst it's true that there is a diversity of pornographies, heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and so on, I do not bracket minority pornographies as completely distinct from mainstream heterosexual pornography. Firstly, the myriad of pornographies all fall into the category of what Foucault calls the incitement to speak sex. Moreover, whether it's gay, lesbian, or transgender, femininity and masculinity are played out and continuously demonstrate what the woman is for. And here the woman can be, for example, the feminized man in gay pornography. So my argument in this lecture is not that parts of the pornography industry are exploitative and should or could be rendered ethical by changes to certain practices, for example, health and safety regulations, limiting working hours or enforcing the use of condoms to prevent the spread of STDs, ensuring performers fully consent and are not trafficked, and that performers are adults, etc. I argue that pornography is inherently exploitative and immoral. And this exploitation is not avoided by its tiny sub-branches, for example, the production of so-called feminist porn or ethical porn. These latter are products of the same mechanisms, the same technologies of knowledge and power as mainstream pornography. So, pornography critique using Foucault and Dworkin is not about obscenity. It's not about what should or should not be shown. It is about the meaning of what is shown. The deconstruction of pornography and discourses of sexuality opens up a space for us to understand how we've become the sexual subjects we have in the 21st century, and it invites us to imagine what Foucault describes as becoming otherwise. We can't become otherwise unless we know how we have become, how we've been put together as human subjects in the first place. And I'm going to end now with the words of Rachel Moran, who is an exit prostitute who also worked in the pornography industry. And I'm going to use her words because she talks about how difficult it is to use the words immoral in relation to sexual practices nowadays. So, she says in her book, Paid For, when she describes her own experiences, she says we're all moralists unless we're psychopaths. And since when was morality a dirty word? Here's the answer to that. Morality has been a dirty word since it suited certain people that we look the other way and pretend that morality is null and void here. And you will find, time and again, that people who espouse that position are defending something which is very plainly wrong, hence their absolute insistence that morality shouldn't get a look in. There's also the nonsense claim that those who oppose prostitution and pornography do so necessarily from a religious standpoint, as though there were any shortage of ethical atheists in the world. The moral principles that govern or influence conduct often have no basis other than our own innate sense of what it is or is not harmful in human behavior. Pornography is damaging to the human psyche on every conceivable level. It is exactly its harmful, degrading nature that gives rise to the instant sense of objection we feel when we imagine the acts that take place in pornography featuring in the lives, the actual material lives of people that we love. And I'd like to say one more thing. In contrast to the idea that pornography is about fantasy, pornography is actually the filming of real human beings who are experiencing what they're experiencing, and the people who are finding those images erotic have actually no idea whether the people that they're masturbating to are trafficked, gave their consent, or are enjoying it. Because pornography is about the performance of sexual pleasure and sexual freedom. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got some time for questions. If you just want to indicate at any point, I'll just write your name down, even if I don't know your name, I'll write it down in a code I have. Okay, so if anyone want to begin with some questions, master questions. Okay, one at the front.
Okay, I was hoping it'd be okay for me to ask you a very short series of questions, just so I can understand where, in your view, the immorality kind of comes in. So, is it possible for two people to have sex and it not be immoral?
I don't understand your question.
Is it possible for two people to have sex with each other and it to be morally fine, like no problem?
Do you mean?
I'd like to ask you a question back, if you don't mind me doing that. I'm wondering on what basis, or what it is that I've said, that led you to the belief that I might see that any sexual contact between people is immoral?
It's because I'm not sure, I guess because I haven't maybe fully understood your argument at what point in the process, so at what point it becomes something moral. So I guess you're saying it is possible for two people to have sex, and that's fine morally. That's of course. And then
I hope so.
So it's okay.
Otherwise, there's not much fun around for the rest of it.
Okay. Then someone else, like someone who's who they both consent to watching, could watch them have sex, and could that be fine as well? Like someone in the room could watch it, and that's also morally fine.
What I'm trying to do here is not to talk about individual acts and what people do or do not find pleasurable and what people do in private, as it were. I'm drawing attention to the social structures in which pornography is made and in which it has its effects.
Okay, so so it's probably fine for someone to watch it in a room. They could even take a recording, and as long as that recording was shared amongst, if like the people who were filmed consented to that being shared with particular people, I guess we're saying that's fine because it's kind of at this stage it's all private. It's only when that recording gets, I guess, sort of shared publicly to people that the performers don't consent to. Is that when it becomes immoral?
I think I'm going to be pulled down a road here that I don't want to go down, so I'm going to answer it in a different kind of way.
Okay.
It's often said to me that human beings naturally are voyeuristic. They would naturally want to look at other people having sex and find that sexually pleasurable. And I think that may be where you're coming from when you're saying that. And my answer to that is, that relies upon a particular notion of what is natural. And the particular notion of what is natural is emerging from pornography rather than the other way around. So it's not that we have these fantasies and these ideas and we find it erotic to look at other people having sex, but that actually pornography induces us to have those desires, it induces us to have those fantasies, and it tells us that it's natural to do so.
Okay.
Okay.
I was just wondering, do you think it's possible to have a sort of, a healthy, non-problematic heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman in this culture?
I think it's difficult. I think it's really difficult. It depends what we mean by healthy, but if you're meaning in a sort of an egalitarian relationship in which one is not subordinate to another. None of us can stand outside of the culture in which we live. The culture in which we live is imbued with this patriarchal subordination, and it takes many forms, and sometimes it's greater and sometimes less, but it hasn't disappeared. And pornography is sure not making it disappear. Pornography is entrenching that. And our lives, our imaginations are hugely determined by pornography, I think, in the 21st century, in one way to a greater or lesser degree.
Okay.
Did you want to know?
Sorry.
Did you have a
sorry.
Sorry.
A quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
Do you think that it is possible then to either like change your sexuality or become asexual, for example, as a way of avoiding perpetuating sort of problematic dynamics between men and women in society?
I think the idea that we're all happy with the state of sexual affairs at the moment is an illusion. And I think that probably many people, although I don't have access, of course, to what everybody thinks, but I think that many people are negotiating around the problem of sexuality. And one way of negotiating that is to become celibate.
Okay.
And an honourable way, too, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks.
Recently I watched an interesting TED talk by a female porn producer and a self-declared feminist, and she was arguing that she doesn't think there's anything innately exploitative about pornography, but that in actual practice it is usually exploitative, and that's because very usually, although not always, it's very objectifying of the women performers. And she was arguing that almost all of the producers in the back end of the porn industry are men, and that she was basically arguing that it would be different if more women worked in the industry. What do you think about that?
Good question.
If you don't mind me saying, you were a little bit dismissive of so-called feminists.
The question was that, what's your name? Tina heard a TED talk by a female porn producer who was saying, yes, it is generally exploitative, but not necessarily so, and that's partly to do with the fact that most production is by men, whereas if the industry, i.e. the business element of the industry, the production side was dominated by women, maybe it would be different. And what does Heather think, right? So
Yeah.
Is your name Tina?
Tegan.
Sorry, Tegan. Sorry.
Tegan, that's fine.
That's all right.
Tegan also said a corollary to that. She said, if I may say so, I thought you were being a bit derogatory about in my talk. That's okay to say that.
I didn't say derogatory. I said you were a bit dismissive of so-called feminist porn.
Of so-called feminist porn. I am dismissive, and I think it is so-called feminist. Let me try to break this down into various parts. I've had conversations myself many times with so-called feminist pornographers, and when asked about their feminism and what's feminist about their production, their pornography production, they say things like they have good working conditions for their workers are never made to do anything that they don't want to do.
Well, that should be standard. That wasn't exactly what this person was talking about.
Okay.
Just let Heather.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And I was just going to say what Tegan said. This should be nothing special about this. This does not make it feminist. This just makes it more humane. This is what should be happening. Now, the feminist argument then goes on, and the argument that pornography can be feminist goes on, to say something like this, and it falls into what I'm calling the liberal feminist argument. that anything that the woman wants to do, if she wants to do it, is about her own sexual agency, and that makes it feminist, just because a woman wants to do it. And I fundamentally disagree with that position. Feminism isn't about the individual, it's a political stance which is about the collectivity. It's about the collectivity of women. So the feminist pornographer that I was speaking to said something like this. She has sexual fantasies about being spanked. She likes it. It's a sexual pleasure. It's pleasurable to her. And she doesn't want anybody telling her that it's not pleasure, that she shouldn't find pleasure in it. And that she makes pornography about women being spanked. Now, I looked at her site, and there is a guy, a middle-aged guy, not particularly attractive in my view, but other people might think something else, with this person who's both a producer and a performer, who is dressed with plaits and a school tie and shirt, but she's naked below that, and she's being beaten on the bottom till her bottom is red raw. So she gets pleasure from that, and he's the school teacher spanking. Now, really, it is of no concern to me whether she gets pleasure from that or not. But the point is that she is putting those images into the public domain, and nobody looking at that knows that when she is being spanked by an older guy, and she looks like a girl of about 14 in there, that she is doing it for feminist purposes. The translation of those images are the complete and utter orthodox reactionary view that women are there to be used, they're the other, you can abuse them, and the man is in a position of dominance. So whatever her intent is, the representations are totally fitting in with mainstream pornography. But also, the last bit of the answer I want to talk about is there is a study, and don't just have it from the author of it is not tripping off my tongue here, but I could find it for you if anybody wanted to contact me about it, did a content analysis of alleged feminist pornography. And there was as much violence towards women in feminist pornography, alleged feminist pornography, as in any other pornography. The only difference was that often they got the woman to enact violence against another woman. So there were women in positions of dominance, but they weren't in positions of dominance over men, they were in positions of dominance over women again, too. So I have yet to be shown feminist pornography or to be convinced by any argument that pornography is feminist. Maybe at some future moment in history when patriarchy is dissolved into nothingness, we can look at feminist pornography again. But at this moment in time, I don't think it exists.
Okay. Do you have a question? Yeah.
I've only recently been introduced to Foucault. So I don't really know anything about his age or anything else. But it occurs to me that his investigations were done around about the 70s. I wonder what he would think now with the introduction of the internet, because I would imagine that the pornography that's available now is completely off the scale where what he was being able to view is. Do you think that's a justified?
Absolutely, you're making a very sensible point. Absolutely. I just want to point out, for those people who don't know about Foucault, Foucault talks minimally about pornography. It's not the focus of his analysis. It was for Andrea Dworkin, the second theorist I spoke about. In writing this lecture, I went back to the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, which is a very thin book that Foucault wrote in the 1970s. And I was amazed at how relevant it still is today. So in a sense, it doesn't matter that internet pornography exists now and it didn't then, because what he talks about is the proliferation and incitement to talk about sexuality. It's as if we're all under this injunction to see sexuality as to discover what it is about sexuality is the key to ourselves. So the fact that you know, he forecast something, he was describing something, which in a sense is you set off a train. His train is the incitement to sexuality, and it's just continuing in its way, and it will do, and take different historical forms, i.e. we now have the internet, but it will be the same thing until, it's no doubt we will. We change our focus because human being, you know, history never stops. So, yeah.
Can I just carry on from that as well?
Very quickly.
The other thing that springs to mind as well is this sort of liberation of sexuality and gender and everything else. There's a lot of talk at the moment about, you know, what's a male, what's a female, and everything else. I wonder if there's anything underlying the kind of, not the right word, but offensive pornography that is kind of easily available today, if a lot of that is born out of trying to close the differences between male and female sexuality. Do you understand what I mean? Is it just is it just trying to bring it out and saying, you know, men and women are just the same, it's just that one's been more repressed than the other, or...
I'm not quite sure. You think you're saying quite a lot of things there. If I can try to disentangle some of them. My own view is that gender fluidity, to not reify masculinity and to not reify femininity as two separate things, is a good thing. I'm absolutely pro gender fluidity. I don't think pornography helps that, as I've said, so I don't need to repeat it.
No.
I think it reproduces a gender division.
Because I was kind of thinking that it was almost trying to close the division.
Pornography.
In a way. The expression of it. I know what you're saying. It's that it's not. It's against femininity. I completely agree. But I feel if there's something innate that's coming out that's making us all as bad as each other, i.e. male, female, there is no difference.
I see. Let me just try and respond in this way. I don't think I really believe in such a thing as something innate that's coming out. I think that what is actually happening is that we're in a state of utter confusion about sexuality and gender at the moment.
Very much so.
And I think that there are many discourses involved here which are clashing, competing, intersecting, and so on. Possibly this is almost a consequence of what Foucault is talking about, that if our emphasis is on gender, if our emphasis is on sexuality so much, if we're so focused on it, that's what we will do. We will focus on it. And if we stop focusing, in a way, there's very little place to go now because it is everywhere. The sexualization of culture is everywhere, so there's very little to do other than to go inside around this and to try to make sense of our own sexuality and gender, with all the different ways that the competing ways in which we have to make sense of it. I mean, what Foucault does say is, and I nearly put it as a quote, but I didn't, which was this, that, you know, in a world in which we have the capacity to, you know, we make nuclear weapons, we could kill ourselves on a mass scale, we have many things to be anxious and to worry about. One day we may look back at this age in which we live and wonder, how is it that those people took the time to focus on the interior of themselves in relation to sexuality, as if sexuality was the key to the universe. It is the most peculiar thing that we're collectively, culturally engaged in. Yeah.
Okay, Rosie?
Hi. I've done some reading with Natasha Waters. She wrote a book called Living Dolls a few years ago.
Yeah.
And in it, she kind of she looks at different girls and women from different age groups and different social backgrounds, etc. And she talks a lot about how sort of the pornographic nature of society at the moment, how it's getting more and more prolific. It's kind of like it's subconsciously entering into the minds of women and young girls and sort of like making it more and more okay, and then like sort of upping the ante in a way, if that makes sense. Like, would you agree, like, porn is becoming so naturalised, and like you said at one point, oh yeah, women watch porn as well, as you sort of argue. Would you say that's kind of like, it's just sort of, you know, creating women in the shape that men want to see it, it's normalising that sort of?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects to this debate, actually. Both Foucault and Dworkin talk about how we become subjects. So the idea of the liberal subject is that somehow we stand outside of society. We may be socialised by various aspects of society, but we stand outside of society and we each have agency and autonomy. This position that I've been talking about reverses that. It's saying that we are made into subjects. And in the making of subjects, Foucault has a word for it, he calls it governmentality. We're governed into thinking that that we're free. And at the moment that we think we're most free is the moment at which we're most disciplined. This is Foucault's argument. And we can bring this to pornography and the influence that it's having, say, the example you used, with girls and young women and older women too. And that is that whilst we have a sense that, or we're told, discursively as it were, that pornography is about women's liberation, women's sexual freedom, what we can see happening is that women discipline themselves in relation to pornography. And if you don't have any other narrative, if you don't have any other way of understanding your sexuality as a young woman growing up at the moment, you turn to pornography as your teacher, as it were. And what you actually see, apart from all the moaning and groaning, and I don't know, you look at it and think, God, that's painful. But anyway, what young women learn is that it's actually not about their sexual pleasure. It is about servicing men. Many young women don't even know how to be agents of their own sexuality, don't even know how to claim their own sexuality. And how could they know? Because the dominant discourses tell them that the things that they're supposed to find pleasurable are actually things that men find pleasurable, or the pornographic imagination tells men that they should find pleasurable. So, I mean, there are many studies being done at the moment from young girls who who talk about being frightened of anal sex and horrified by this, that, and the other, but feel that they have the expectation of their boyfriend is that this is what they should be doing. And of course, young boys too are inducted into this, and they understand their own masculinity in terms of requiring this of their girlfriends. I was talking to some students in Leicester about this, and I showed a film by Gail Dines. It's called Pornland. I don't know whether anybody's seen it. And the film is made to refute the idea that has always said that pornography isn't that violent. So she demonstrates the violence in ordinary bog standard pornography that you would get to if you just Google pornography into it, and you'd be there within 2 minutes. People always say pornography is not violent, it's not that violent, or they say they don't look at internet, they don't look at the violence, that's somebody else is looking at the violence, they don't see the violence in it. So her film is dedicated to demonstrating there is violence constantly in pornography. And a young woman who'd watched that said, she was sitting in the front row here. She didn't actually say it directly to me. She said it to her companion, and I was teaching this with somebody else. So the person I was with was listening to what these young women were saying as I was speaking to somebody else. And the woman had said, if a man doesn't you know, pull my hair, call me a dirty bitch, and do all the other things that the pornography is, that happens in pornography. She doesn't respect him. She doesn't think that he's manly enough. So, women and men are constructed by the pornographic imagination. It's not just something that men are doing to women who are outside of that. All of us are produced. All of us are constructed as subjects within a very sexualized culture.
Okay, Dave.
Nice one. First question. The way you couched it was as if there were two opposing positions on sex work and pornography. On the one hand, the liberal feminist position that it's liberatory and all the rest of it, and on the other hand, I suppose what you're inhabiting, the radical feminist position. What about the Marxist position, which looks at sex work as work, that the people engaged in it are reproducing society, reproducing themselves, i.e. they're gaining a wage, and therefore it brings with it a whole host of other resistances that you find in normal forms of work, unionisation, struggle against your employer, things like that. And part of that resistance may well be trying to produce feminist porn, i.e. porn that doesn't degrade the women who are making it. You might well form a cooperative or a collective that tries to do that. You know more than me, you've spoken to more people than I have. It may well be in a shitty situation at the moment, but could it not be that over a period of time you can start to produce feminist porn in sort of pockets, as you describe them, and they become more generalised? Third point, isn't there a distinction to be made between sex work, i.e. when you're employed for a wage and as a worker under capitalism, and sex trafficking where you are owned as a slave? And the fourth point, are sex workers and women who enjoy pornography suffering from false consciousness, in your view?
I need to write a book to answer those questions.
Bloody good question.
I'm writing them.
Yeah.
I think somebody just said they're good questions. Is that so? Mm-hmm. They are, I have to say, the orthodox questions that are asked. The typical questions that are asked. If you come from the position that prostitution is sex work rather than prostitution. So I think you asked me 4 different things, and if you could ask me them again, but in a very abbreviated form, but one at a time, and I'll go through them. So what was your first point?
First one, the Marxist view as distinct from the other 2 views that sex work is work and with it brings forms of resistance.
Well, the Marxist view isn't separate from the liberal feminist view. They've become, if I could answer, they've become conflated now, because liberal feminists believe that prostitution should be reframed as sex work, and that there's no difference between sex work and any other form of labour. So the argument goes that we're all exploited under capitalism. I mean, you no doubt are familiar with these arguments. We're all exploited under capitalism, so there's no difference between working in McDonald's and using your own body as an object in the period of time in which you're working, and then your body becomes yours afterwards. So the second part of that was that in some sense this creates resistance to capitalism?
I don't know. It's an open-ended question. It's not something that I'm in position on. It's just that within those spheres, in the same way that under capitalism you might want to form a cooperative to engender egalitarian forms of interaction economically, within sex work and pornography you might want to try and create cultural forms of,
Sorry, I think we could spend ages on this, and I probably want to draw it to a close using not particularly actually going through the 4 points, which I thought I was going to do. I don't know what an egalitarian collective situation is that you're talking about, because you could, yeah, and I thought you might not. Sorry, I really don't mean to be insulting, but you know, I've just been to Germany. I literally came back from Germany yesterday. I was doing some research on decriminalisation of prostitution in Germany, so that it's now sex work. And I can tell you there are collectivities of women in brothels, and they call themselves sex workers, not prostitutes. That collectivity of prostitutes makes no difference whatsoever to patriarchal social structures. In relation to consenting and trafficking, there's a distinction constantly made because, of course, everybody is against trafficking. We would all right-minded people be against trafficking. But we argue then that people who are consenting to sex work, if they haven't been trafficked, then their labour becomes permissible labour, just like any other labour under capitalism. Well, of course, there is not a distinction between trafficking and prostitution in that way, or sex work. In Germany, a lot of the women who are working in prostitution are from Eastern European countries. And it's very difficult to know whether they've been trafficked or not. And it's difficult to know what trafficking actually means. If you've moved from your home, your family, your country to find labour, to be paid in another country, and if somebody has told you that if you go to Germany you'll earn lots of money, and if you go with a boyfriend who ends up suggesting that what you do is that you go out and prostitute yourself, you get into a situation which is hugely exploitative. And I could tell you some really awful stories, actually, of the use of prostituted women by men. It does not look like sexual liberation.
I'm sure
and
I
it
can tell you some
does
stories.
not look like labour in any other form. It really doesn't. It feels like the most dehumanising aspect of the human condition to use women as sexual objects for male gratification. That is actually what it looks like.
Okay, Bob?
Yeah, I wonder if we could drag the conversation back to pornography.
Yeah.
And partly just reflect a bit on, okay, almost all the discussion was a visual, a film of pornography. How does your argument work in respect, say, of written pornography? Because I think a little bit on that might uncover some things about it's the so-called consumer that is perhaps at the heart of what you're saying, rather than necessarily the so-called participants. And that's something that liberals always forget, of course, because they don't like it.
That it's the consumer. You see, just...
You know, you made a point earlier on, you said we're all affected by this, whether we take part or not.
Yes.
And I think you're right.
Yes.
But I'm just wondering if it might be interesting just to say a bit more about that aspect of your position. How can that be? Yeah.
Again, I think I'm not quite understanding you, but come back to me after I've said what I'm going to say now. I'm not sure that it's the consumer we forget about. The liberals don't forget about the consumers. The liberals are totally focused on the consumers' rights to consume, and so on and so forth. The right of the individual to sexual pleasure, and so on. What is forgotten in the liberal argument is those who are consumed, because we imagine that pornography is just about fantasy.
Right,
Yeah.
let's take it from there. How does that argument work in respect of written as opposed to filmed pornography?
I think that the crucial difference about written pornography is that you're not actually using the bodies of other people in order for your sexual gratification.
So would you be more liberal about written pornography than visual pornography?
When you say would I be more liberal, do you mean do I think that there's something less dangerous about written pornography than visual pornography?
Something like that, yeah. And the reason I'm asking it isn't to sort of play around with semantics or something. It's to get back to your position that there's something about all this that affects even those people who have no direct role in it. So, for instance, the very existence, I think, of written pornography affects people's understanding of themselves and of sexuality and of human relations, whether they've ever read any of it or not. And that's the bit that I'm interested in.
In which way do you think that written pornography affects everyone, whether they've ever read any or not?
Because somebody else will have read somebody else will come to understand sexual relations in certain ways, that will be passed on to somebody else. And, you know, it's less effective than visual pornography because we inhabit a visual culture. But I certainly wouldn't want to analyse it any less critically than visual pornography. Because the problem, I'm trying to agree with you, I think the problem is the social effect rather than the effect on particular individuals in their own individual lives.
Absolutely, it's the social effect. Absolutely, it's the social effect.
And I think it might be sometimes easier to show that through the written form than the visual form, because then we don't have actual, real, so-called workers being affected. It's just literally in somebody's, usually but not always, a man's head. Right. We can sort of focus on it very, in terms of production. You know, an author writing this stuff. We don't have to worry about real people in real situations. We just think about the effect of thinking about understanding sexual and other relations in these sorts of ways.
In some mysterious way, whatever happens in one part of the culture will affect the culture at large. This is the case. And so, if you have a population in which only some people could ever read, nevertheless, those people who did read and did think, their thoughts, their ideas, eventually spread out into the culture in one form or another. So the answer to that is, in a sense, there's nothing that we can do which will be discrete in that way, which stands outside of it. Somehow it has its effects. I think the issue of visual pornography is that we live in a very visual culture and we're all channeled into this particular culture now, and it has an immediacy that the work of reading a text, the text put us into a context in which we have to work at the understanding of meaning, whereas our visual culture is just making meaning, and it's percolating through, and we don't even experience ourselves as having to have any distance from it whatsoever.
Okay, Tom?
So, I'm sorry if I misunderstood what you were trying to say, and if that's the case, I need some clarification.
Yeah.
But it seems as if when you were talking about your issues with gay, lesbian and transsexual pornography, was that they, like, gay or lesbian porn was still framed in this idea of masculine and feminine, which I would have, I think is problematic, because that's not necessarily what homosexuality is. And I'd also like to question you on what about the places in between, inside of this gender binary, like trans-feminine, genderqueer, gender-fluid people, where do they sit in within this narrative of masculinity and femininity that you presented? And therefore, would porn that involves genderqueer, gender-fluid people, that isn't necessarily about the masculine dominion over the feminine, where would that come in? And therefore, is it necessarily pornography that's a problem, or is it the gender binary and specifically the masculine dominion over the feminine?
I'm going to say something back which might annoy you. I think that whenever the issue of women and the abuse of women comes into focus as a political phenomenon, it will be sidelined in terms of the rights of other people, however small the groups are who are making the claim that they are being, the immorality lies in the lack of understanding of their position. So, for example, I think that gay, lesbian and transsexual pornography is still a very small part of the overall pornography that there is, which is about sexual violence and violation of women. That's what the representations of pornography are about. Now, I am not an expert on gay and lesbian and transsexual or transgender pornography. What I do know and what I have seen is that masculinity and femininity are being played out. Now, one could argue that that is a playful thing, and that what that is doing what one of the other questioners asked, which is about how do we make sense of our gender, and it's about becoming more gender fluid and so on. I wish that were the case. I would like that to be the case. But I don't see that that is the case. I think that we have the femininity is both, in pornography, is both real, and that these things actually happen to real women, the gagging, the choking and so on, the name calling, but that it's also symbolic. It is a symbolic enactment of the feminine as embodied and being dehumanized in that embodiment. And the gay pornography that I've seen, and I'm open to somebody telling me that this isn't the case, but the gay pornography I've seen plays out a dominant male and a feminine bottom boy, as it were, and that what is actually happening is that this is just calling upon the orthodox discourses of femininity and masculinity.
Okay. Hugo, behind, did you want to come back, Tom? Or?
My question was already asked.
Okay. Then in which case, behind Dave, glasses, curly hair. You.
Do you think there's any hope to resist porn culture, given that we live in already a sort of neoliberal hyper-consumer culture? You know, is there any, do we stand a chance, or are they interlinked inherently?
Well, I think they're interlinked. Is there a chance of resistance? You know, if human beings had thought that there was never a possibility of resistance, that we should accept the status quo, there would be no social change. I mean, social change is brought about for all kinds of reasons, including resistance. So I think that resistance won't take the form of a revolution. I mean, why I think that at this moment in time it would be ridiculous to argue that pornography should be censored and forbidden is because it would incite more pornography. It would play into the people who think that they're doing something really radical by masturbating to images of a woman being raped or mouth-fucked or whatever. So to ban it is not what I'm arguing for. What I think we can do is examine our position, our own subjectivities, our own pleasures and so on, and do what Foucault argues about. How can we be otherwise than what we are? And to collect with other people to create different kinds of discourses and languages around this, to open the conversation. I think opening a critical conversation is really, really powerful, actually, as a subversive thing to do. At one point, to have any criticism of pornography was practically to incite, I'm going to say riots, that's ridiculous, but to incite really strong feelings in one's audience of resistance to what one was saying. And now, you're quite quiescent and respectful and so on and so forth. Because I think that people are beginning to hear objections to pornography without assuming that in that objection what you're doing is want a sense of sexual pleasure. Yeah.
Megan, do you have a question? Or what? No, someone there had a hand up ages ago, but okay.
Briefly, but
You're abandoning it, that's fine.
actually, fuck it, I'll
Okay, go for it.
First of all, thank you, I really enjoyed that talk.
Thank you.
So would you say that any form of so-called sexual liberation of anyone who doesn't identify as a heterosexual male is inherently counterproductive due to the fact that it can only serve its purpose as being existing in relation to the male gaze and to benefit the male gaze? So it's inherently counterproductive. It's only been the narrative of the male gaze that is so-called sexual liberation.
I think it is. I think it is. And so whether you're looking at pornography as a man or a woman, I think you're looking at it through the male gaze. It's very difficult to escape that.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
Layla, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Layla.
Hi. I wanted to go back to one of the arguments you made, which is pornography is prostitution.
Yeah. Filmed prostitution.
Sorry?
Filmed prostitution, it is.
Okay, no, I wanted to ask you, don't you think that prostitutes are, in a way, victims of pornography?
I know that prostituted women are victims of pornography because the things that the Johns ask them to do now are getting more and more to do with things that they've seen in pornography.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is my point. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is
absolutely, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
So why do you think pornography is prostitution? Are they the same thing? So why do you think they are the same thing, pornography and prostitution?
They're the same thing because women get paid for performing sexual pleasure. They get paid to do that. If they were, the relationship is inherently problematic. The man pays to get what he thinks is a natural response from the woman. In fact, he's paying her to pretend that she is giving sexual pleasure. So women, for a start, the pornography industry and the prostitution industry are so interlinked with each other. Conceptually, we have them apart, but women work in both, and there's a lot of crossover going on. And the crossover is that women and some men, obviously, also work as prostitutes and pornography performers, get paid by an industry. It's an industry that is employing them, whether it's that it gets linked up to an industry. So in prostitution, you will have pimps who are pimping the women, and then above them that they will have the person above them, and so on and so forth, and then organised trafficking of people. And the same applies to pornography. So a prostituted woman might go into prostitution thinking, I'm going to earn in a day what I would have to earn working in prostitution, and get more money in a day than I get working for a whole week in some other kind of job. And then it doesn't turn out to be like that. I mean, prostitution is very hard labour. And young women often go into pornography, and the narrative of pornography is that it's glamorous, and go into pornography and find again they're being paid to perform enjoying sex. So, and they find that pornography isn't the glamorous world they thought it was going to be. But it's filmed.
Sorry. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
I've got a question over there.
Thanks, I'm Russell.
Hi, Russell.
Hi. I think a lot of what you've described in the pornographic world we'd all agree is pretty horrifying, sort of non-consensual and violent sex. I wondered whether you could conceive of a sort of a film about the physical intimacy which would not be about violent, non-consensual, dominant sex. In other words, could we show an image of sexuality which could be considered to be actually quite attractive, and would that then not be pornography, or just interested about where the boundary would lie? Could we make a film that would teach people about equality and sexuality?
You know, I think the best teacher of equality and sexuality would be to leave young people to get on with exploring their sexuality with each other in the kind of relationships where young girls feel that they're entitled to their own sexuality and young boys feel that they're entitled to their own sexuality without dominating girls. I'd love a society in which people came to their sexuality without having to watch a film. I don't think we need to watch films in order to have that vision of sexuality. Also, I don't want to be led down the road of, is it possible for there to be a film about mutual, pleasurable sexuality? Because on the one hand, of course, that's a possibility. It would be ridiculous to refute that. But in the asking of it, or in the answering of it, I know what actually happens. A polarization gets set up, and it's polarization I don't want to be set up. And the polarization is, well, there's this nasty pornography, but you see, there's also this nice pornography. There are these videos where this man and woman are thoroughly enjoying each other. There's nothing distasteful or hurtful about it or exploitative about it. In that polarization, it sets up that there is a really nasty pornography that probably right-minded people wouldn't watch, but actually, shall we just put those nice films on the shelf here for the moment? Because what I'm trying to talk about is this mainstream pornography. And it is mainstream, and it is what people are looking at. Now, I can tell you a little story that happens to me all the time, that when I talk about mainstream violent pornography, mainstream pornography as violent, it doesn't matter how many times I say, I'm talking about the pornography that if you Google, you put pornography in, it's the first images, it isn't, you don't even have to have images. The strap line of a lot of pornography sites are, 20 whores, fuck a slut, and verbally before you even get into the images. And it is men say to me, I don't watch that kind of pornography. I really don't watch that kind of porn. I never watch violent images. Yeah, okay, I watch pornography, but I never watch violent images. So one wonders how they ever get to the non-violent images.
You think that women would never watch? There's no women, because I think that people who watch sadistic and violent images are not the kinds of people that I would call healthy, balanced people. And I feel a bit uncertain about you saying that it's only men.
Right, you've said two things there. You said healthy, balanced people wouldn't watch violent pornography. I think you said that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe that.
And you believe that. I know a lot of nice guys believe that. And you also said that women watch pornography too. Right. These are things that are said constantly about pornography. And I hope that I'm refuting that here. I absolutely refute both of those things. I think women do watch pornography. And I think I've said that women watch pornography. I didn't say that women didn't watch pornography. What I've tried to say is that women are subjects, agents. Their subjectivities are created in this culture as much as men's are. And our the sexual narrative that we have, which pornography conveys, is male sexual dominance and women as violable. That's what pornography is. Now, you can then say to me that those people who watch that kind of pornography are, what were the words you used? Not nice men, not...
I don't think anybody who watches...
Sadistic and imbalanced.
Sadistic and unbalanced. Okay, right. Now, I can tell you, I don't mean to use the word nice in a pejorative sense when I say nice men. I'm not actually being cynical here when I say that. I'm telling you that nice men, not the men that I would think of as nice, they wouldn't expect their wives to cook and clean for them. They look after the children. They're happy that their wives go out to work, or their partners, or whatever. They believe in egalitarian relationships. These kind of men say to me, always, those people who watch pornographic, violent pornography are sadistic and unbalanced. We are not those kinds of men. There are those men over there, they do it, but we are not. Now, I would like to ask, what kind of pornography these nice normal guys, not the sadistic ones, are watching when they watch pornography? Because mainstream pornography is about the violation of women. I don't know what happens here, whether there's a psychological disavowal that goes on, that men are looking at this, but they don't understand that that's what they're looking at, or that, you know, how can you look at that and not see that women are being violated? So I know that a human mechanism is to not recognize that what you are doing is problematic. If it gives you pleasure, then you probably want to say, I'm not really doing this, I don't really do that. The point is, I'm not looking at anybody. You are. You are. I use this analogy, even if you weren't, even if the nice guy somehow found this lovely, lovely film, and that's all you wanted to watch, of gender equality and lovely sensual relationship between a man and a woman that wasn't exploitative. It's a bit like, I am a vegan, okay, and I know that I only eat products that don't have animal products in them, but when I go to the supermarket, I have to negotiate my way around everything else in order to get to that product. So I do see the pints of dairy milk, and I do see the meat counter, and I see all of these things. I might only want that one product, but I have to tolerate and see everything else. So even the very nice guy, if all he is watching is that, and I don't believe it is, because I know it's not the case, is seeing all of this other stuff, which is so prevalent, and a multi-billion-dollar industry produces it, churns it out all the time. It's what our 11-year-olds are seeing, but somehow they don't see it. That is very, very strange. I think that when somebody is masturbating to a woman, a bog standard image is of a woman with a penis down her throat, makeup running down her face, eyes bulging, hair being pulled, and just being called a dirty bitch. Is that a prevalent image or not in pornography? Yes. The nice guys are watching that, and I tell you they're being excited by that. I think we should reverse that question around. Why do nice guys find the violation of women erotic? That is the question that we need to start from.
Can I respond and say I find that offensive? You're saying that I find the violation of women erotic. Can I
don't know what you do, Russell. I don't know what you do. There's a hand up over here.
We're running out of time, so and I already had a question at the front. Tegan, did you want to ask your question? Because we're literally, it's 8 past already.
Okay.
Very quickly, because then I'm going to let her ask a question, then we're going to go.
I don't. If you want to give me an answer, that's great, but it's more of a comment, really.
Okay.
I just wanted to say that when you say that that all mainstream porn is about violence and violation of women, I find it a little bit hard to be clear about what you mean, because throughout your talk, at a few points you listed quite a few kind of kinky sex acts with rape thrown in as like another form, and I find that really shocking and quite worrying. I don't
That's it.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear that somebody finds the idea that pornography represents rape shocking. I'm so pleased to hear you say that. It is shocking.
But
what is shocking is that it is actually mainstream. It is mainstream, and it's surely shocking. And our sensibilities should arrive at the point where it is shocking, and that we can talk about this without somebody saying, Russell, that they're offended by it. You may be offended by it. You may be offended by it, and it's really good that a man would feel offended by the idea that there is a suggestion that it's normalized for men to find the violation of women erotic. So all the men who are offended by it should stand up and object to the way that they are being induced by pornography to find the violation of women erotic.
Okay, very quickly, final question.
So I'm kind of hearing that your main argument is that pornography is mainly about the violation of women for the sexual pleasure of men. Can I ask how you would apply that argument to, for example, a pornographic video of two women having sex and pleasuring each other?
I think I would answer it a bit like that I answered about feminist porn. There are many, many images of women pleasuring each other. They're not exceptional. They're quite... women pleasuring each other is a standard, exciting image for heterosexual men. Usually what actually happens in images where women pleasure each other, they do it and then the guy comes in. So he's the final, he's the real sex starts. Lesbian pornography shows women pleasuring each other, but there is brutality in lesbian pornography. There is the acting out of masculinity and femininity and dominant and submissive in lesbian pornography. My main argument is it doesn't matter what image we use, every image is pulled into the dominant social structure that Dworkin talks about. That basically we have culturally, there are those women who are good women, and there are those women who are whores. And I think this is just as prevalent now. Young women negotiate within their sexuality. If they have sex, if they don't have sex, the old story about them being frigid and so on. If they have sex, or too much sex, or more than one partner, then they become a whore. So that virgin-whore dichotomy is being negotiated all the time. I think all women negotiate that. All women negotiate that. And I think that comes from the idea that there are some women who are sluts. And there are other women who are outside of that category. I mean, I don't think that women or anybody can be categorized in that way. But pornography does it. And it kind of justifies the things that are being done to women. If that is what a woman is, that all she is, as Dworkin says, as somebody who doesn't respect herself, who's kind of made for it, then you can do what you like to her because she's made for that. And pornography reiterates that all the time. She's a slut, she's a whore. We can do that to her. Almost the pleasure in doing that to her. Now, sorry, there was some other point that I was going to say. No.
Okay, before we say thank you, we're going to go to the pub, the Wagon and Horses, which, if you don't know, is on New Road near the Dome, straight down Edward Street. You should all know it's near the old courtroom. It's where we always go. So please join us if you want to ask Heather further questions. But can we say thank you for a really strong